Hi and welcome to a special coronavirus edition of Galvanised Senki. Over the years, quite a few people have asked me about the restoration of my Thwaites Tusker, so today I'm going to try and run through a couple of the commonly found challenges with these machines and hopefully give you some help and advice with your machine. A lot of people have asked how these machines were built this way and why they're not made this way anymore. Well, back when these were conceived, probably in the 1960s, around about that time, manufacturing technology wasn't what it is now, and the ability to make small parts cheaply wasn't really that well around. If you think of a large 360-degree excavator, they contain all the same parts that a modern compact mini excavator does. It's just that they're a bit smaller, and it's the cost of making them, not the material cost, the actual processes of making them. If you scale down a 20-ton excavator into a 2.5 or 3-ton machine like this, the maths don't work out, or didn't work out then, as to how little one of these would cost. So instead people were building backhoes based on a dumper chassis because it was cheap and easy and reasonably effective. These machines are now of course completely outdated because modern computer controlled machines and laser cutters and things can knock out mini diggers at what people see as a competitive price. Hence these are now a thing of the past, but still eminently usable given a bit of care and understanding and patience. A lot of people have asked me about spare parts. The manufacturers of this machine, Thwaites, are still going. They're in Leamington Spa in the UK, and amazingly they still hold a number of spare parts for this machine. Not everything, but they do hold some spares, and if you speak to them via one of their agents with the part number, you might be surprised at some of the prices. Some of the prices are not terribly bad at all. In order to order spare parts, you're going to have to identify your machine, and this is where Thwaites come in handy. You will need a serial number of some sort. Typically on these machines, in serial number, may be located somewhere along this cross member. It'll be a little red engraved plate with white writing. Can't see it on here. You might find an aluminium plate riveted onto the back of the machine here. You might find a plate here where you can just about see there used to be 2 pop rivets. Or on the other side of the hydraulic tank, you might find another plate. None of this is looking very good, is it? However, the engine, trusty PETA PH2, earlier models use a PETA AVA2. Thwaites can identify your machine using the engine number, providing nobody's changed the engine. So if you quote the engine number to them, which is typically on the rocker covers, or sometimes lower down on the oil filler, they can identify the machine. If they're feeling exceptionally helpful and you're in dire need, they might be able to identify using the gearbox number, but that really is a bit of a hope. Once you've identified the machine, Thwaites will be able to supply you with the age of the machine, which is useful if you're going to register it for road use, and it means that your dealer will be able to act as a spare parts source for you. Before continuing, and these are exceptionally well designed machines for what they are, there's one thing that I really recommend you try in terms of a modification. These machines as they are have the offset engine, more on that later, but to stop the engine as supplied from the factory, you need to get off the machine and walk over to here to reach the engine stop control. This just isn't good, especially the same if you're in the digger seat. If something goes wrong, if you burst a hose, if you sense that any of the controls aren't working properly, having to get off the machine to stop it doesn't seem especially safe. For this reason, I've fitted a simple and inexpensive pull to stop lever. These are available online, which means you can stop the engine from the driving position. It's quite possible to reach from the digger operator's seat and quickly spin round to pull the button on the column, so you can stop the machine from either position. Thwaites can still supply the operators and service manuals to these machines, but time's moved on a bit, especially filter numbers. Here's some condensed data you might find useful. If you've got an older manual for the PETA AVA or PH engines, don't get too tied up with oil specifications. Some of those you'll have great trouble finding. Times have moved on, and a lot of the recommendations which were made at the time are only because those are the oils which were available at the time. A lot of people seem terrified of putting multigrade oil in these engines. It's just because when these engines were built, multigrade oil wasn't really a thing. Looking at the transmission oil, this EP90, the GL4, if you go to a GL5, it's a stronger extreme pressure additive, and as well as smelling absolutely awful, you might start find it eats the bronze elements. This is a really common mistake in old machines. The EP additive can attack the bronze and white metal, yellow metals elements in gearboxes. So if you do go for an EP, don't go higher than a GL4. Gearbox. More on that later. As you can see, there are two oil specs. And some information on parts. The arm slew bump stops are almost always chewed apart. Thwaites don't supply them anymore. This is all pretty explanatory, no longer available, a lot of it is. Most towns or cities have got a specialist that will reline brake and clutch shoes, because you won't get them from Thwaites. The rigid hydraulic lines at Amito, a lot of hydraulic suppliers won't even recognise Amito. I've seen several horrors. This machine had some where people have tried to bodge a metric fitting onto an Amito thread. Doesn't end very well. On the spool valve block at JIC, if you are an engineer and you measure them, I'd not heard of JIC until I'd started on this machine. They are UNF, Unified National Fine Threads, albeit adapted for pipe purposes. One of the most common woes that these machines suffer from is wear in the legs, specifically the leg locking mechanism. What happens is that these pins and rollers become worn, the leg starts to wobble around, and it wears this locking pin. Eventually the pin creeps upwards. These, when I had the machine, were kind of pointing at 45 degrees. So what happens is, as you're digging, the leg wobbles around, the pin works its way out there and the leg collapses. That can be quite dangerous and scary. Here I've put oversized pins in. I've gone up from 1/2 inch to M14 fine. I've turned up some new rollers. I ended up custom making these rollers after taking a lot of measurements to try and even out the wear. That looks pretty ropey there, but when they're lowered it's all good. The locking pin, however, is somewhat more challenging to repair, and I'll just quickly run that through you now after having taken some bits off to make it easier to see. So here's the locking pin. I did a repair on these about 7 years ago, and despite a lot of hard use, there's still absolutely no wear in that pin, and they still needs greasing. It's a little bit sluggish coming back, but absolutely no problem with these pins. The hole through which this pin goes has got this bush which is welded on, this spindle is welded onto the machine and is directly in the way of getting anything in to repair that hole, and had to do a little bit of thinking on this. After I'd done a bit of thinking, I got out my trusty ratchet drill. Here's the link, I've got a video on it, and set to work. It's probably better to watch the video if you're not familiar with these things, but what I did, not only was the pin worn, but the hole through which the pin runs was also terribly worn. In fact, that's where the most of the wear was. This bracket's welded on. I suppose I could have cut it off, and didn't like doing that. So what I did, I used the ratchet drill. I've marked carefully. I've created this hole in the chassis here, and I've drilled through having removed the pin right the way through that bush to enlarge the worn hole, and then I used the reamer to produce a nice accurate round bore. This shiny bit here you can see above the pin is a top hat bush that's been turned to fill that hole. The original pin ended on this place, but I've brought the bush out, A, to give me something to weld onto and a little bit of extra support for the pin. You may have noticed on the back there's also a bit extra length on the bush to give more engagement for the pin and reduce that ability for it to wobble. The pins are out of the N16, the bush is out of the N8, two dissimilar metals so they don't really stick to each other. And this has been quite a successful repair. Coupled with new rollers, it's not been too bad. When I put the new pins in, I thought it'd be very clever and fit grease nipples to them, because one of the downfalls of these when I got the machine is that these had obviously never been properly lubricated and there was lots of rust and wear and cack in them. Grease nipples I've now removed. That was a mistake. All you end up with is a load of grease everywhere, stuck to the legs. It gets all over you when you're operating the machine, attracts loads of dirt. So I've removed the nipples and I've now just left these little holes. Little hole in the end to squirt an oil can into. With the cross drilling so that oil comes out onto the rotating bush. Lots of people might just not bother with all that faff and they might just squirt some oil on the outside, but I tend to think that by introducing oil into where the roller goes, it's probably a better job. Hey, whilst we're looking at the legs, most of these machines have completely knackered feet, no longer available from Thwaites. Quite simple items to make if you don't know how to weld or don't have access to someone who can do kind of agricultural engineering style repairs. Now's the time to address that. Commonly missed item on these legs, as they disintegrate over time, bits of them fall off and people try and make rubbishy replacement ones. But unlike the legs on like a JCB, which have got a flat foot, these have got these big kind of spades that bite into the ground, and these are essential if you're going to have any joy in operating the machine. These really need to penetrate and engage with the ground, otherwise, because the machine is relatively lightweight, all that happens when you try and dig is that you pull the machine forward. So you make the new legs, these nice strong spades will really help you out. Again, on the bottom of the leg, the bush in the leg was horrendously worn. In fact, I don't think it was bushed, it was just worn. So I've increased the pin diameter. Standard is inch, and I've just chucked my little reamer through and made them 1.1 and put a larger pin in. Whilst we're talking about the ratchet drill, another common wear item is these pins here where the digger sub-chassis attaches to the machine main chassis. These pins wear and this sort of rocks back and forth, and when you're trying to dig, all of this sub-chassis moves, including you, because you're sat on it, and it produces a jerky movement in the control levers. It makes the machine really difficult to control. So again, I've set up the ratchet drill. In fact, I didn't drill that one, they weren't that bad. I just put a series of reamers straight through to enlarge these holes with the digger chassis off. There's loads of room to do it. And then turned oversized pins, which are a really nice tight fit, and there's no horrible wobbliness. Whilst we're talking about the legs, a lot of people say, oh, I don't like those legs, I'm going to put hydraulic rams on the front and make it like a JCB. You can do that. These legs are relatively lightweight. If you put hydraulic rams on the front of the machine, you will add a load of weight to the front of the machine, and it's a machine that's already really front heavy and quite tail light. Haha, they say, well, you can add weight to the back of the machine. You can add weight to the back of the machine. However, the people who designed this machine were actually cleverer than I am, and probably cleverer than you. If you add weight to the back of the machine, then it allows you to dig more and la-di-da-di-da. You're exceeding what the machine was originally designed for. It'll be great at first, and after a short while you'll find that your king posts and other parts start filling up with stress cracks. I view the back of the machine lifting in the air as my indication that I'm pushing the machine too hard and that I need to steady back. In addition, if you've seen some of my other Thwaites Tusker videos, you can use the back of the machine, being notoriously tail light, to your advantage. For example, manoeuvring on cramped sites. You can also cross ditches in reverse by exploiting that characteristic. Back to stopping the engine. If any of you think that there might be another way of stopping the engine from the reach of the operator, it's a really bad idea. Lifting the decompressor with the engine running firstly places the pistons at risk of colliding with the exhaust valves, because what this does is to permanently jam open the exhaust valve. If you're lucky enough to get away with that, what it'll do is burn the exhaust valve seat, because the engine is still running and firing and burning fuel whilst you then jam the valve open. As the engine slows down, the fuel injection pumps notice that, because this is a governed engine, and they'll deliver more and more fuel because they notice that the engine's slowing down and they think it needs more fuel. So as the engine's slowing down, and eventually it'll stop burning fuel because you've destroyed the compression, the injectors deliver more and more fuel, trying to speed it back up. This diesel washes down the cylinder bores, destroys the lubrication on your cylinder barrels, and ends up in the sump. None of it's clever. It's just better to stop using the governor arm on the end, or even better, fit a remote stop. Another modification I'd highly recommend is a suspension seat. The original Tusker seats were not suspension models, and you'd only spend a couple of hours in the machine and you'd feel an absolute cripple when you went to bed. These are about the cheapest suspension seats you'll find. They're under £100 delivered. I got these off eBay, and they've absolutely transformed the machine. I can spend all day on this machine now and not feel like a cripple when I go to bed at night. You also get forwards and backwards adjustment and kind of tilty adjustment and all sorts, which you didn't get with the original Thwaites seats. The standard exhaust manifold on these Petter engines is absolutely a standard exhaust manifold, and as far as I can tell there weren't any other optional extras. The standard exhaust exits here, giving you the choice of, none of it's ideal. If you have the exhaust pipe coming out this way, as per some of the illustrations in the catalogue, the fumes invariably blow straight back towards your operating position where you breathe in diesel fumes all day. Some people have the exhaust pointing forwards, which means that the air filter here just sucks the fumes in as you're driving along. But if you have the dumper skip on, I have the skip for this machine but it doesn't frequently go on, the exhaust is blowing into the skip and everything gets in the way. So I machined this, yes, I did say machined. I've made this custom manifold with an expansion box on it, which not only has allowed me to have the exhaust coming up in a much better position, the fumes are coming out above my head and not getting sucked into my lungs or the air filter. By putting this large bore pipe on here, and there's a little restrictor in this end, it's really mellowed down the noise of the exhaust to the point that none of my neighbours have complained about it. This is a standard bit of pipe I got from somewhere or other. I put a little threaded thing on that end in case ever I need to clean it out. I might imagine one day it'll fill up with carbon. During a period when I was feeling really keen, these trumpets here I machined from solid, but normal people might just want to weld on a bit of pipe and just squash the end where these nuts go on so you can get them on easier. This is a copy of a manifold that I've seen on a Fowler diesel engine, which also had a very, very nice mellow exhaust beat. It took me ages, but I'm still pleased with it. Here's a modification I did after the last service, which was only yesterday. These little Cooper's filters, the little bleed screws on the top always strip out and they're crap and they never seal properly. So I had these M6 thumb screws. I've drilled and tapped out the aluminium casting, put a bigger thread in, put a little flat on them so I can bleed off any air. If you're used to these engines in a dumper, you'll know that they'll run all day on a gallon of fuel. However, as soon as you start using the engine in a digger, it's quite frightening how quickly they'll get through fuel, and I've run this out a couple of times. It's kind of surprised me. As regards spares for the engine. Sleeman and Hawkin are my friends. You can ring them up and they send you parts in the post the next day. These little filters are quite small and kind of tank you'd fill off a funnel or jerry can, maybe dirty fuel, and these filters block really quickly and it pays to keep an eye on them and keep them changed. These flexible pipes here are supplied as a kind of a pet, a genuine part, and they're astronomically expensive for what they are. So what happens is, with age, these either relax on the joints and they allow air in, and it's bizarre, they'll let air in but not fuel out, so you can't see you've got a leak but your engine starts running badly. It's because it's sucking air into the injection pumps. The other thing that can happen with these is that they internally delaminate. They get like kind of corrugated cardboard inside and they restrict the flow of fuel, normally also ending up sucking air in. So what I've done with these pumps, these fittings, is to just carefully remove the ends which are crimped on. This is standard fuel hose from a car accessory shop, and I've Jubilee clipped hoses back on. I could have been posh and used crimps, but I didn't. These are the correct tyres for the machine. You see lots of these diggers with Land Rover tyres on and they're just not good enough. These are called open centre tyres. If you speak to your tyre stockist, they're not as much money as what you might think. The size of the front tyres is 750 by 16. And these are the rear tyres. Again, you'll see Land Rover tyres on these machines, and putting Land Rover tyres on the rear of one of these means that you won't be able to steer in mud. You can't steer very well at the best of times. This is a 3-rib tractor tyre, really common. This is a 600 by 16. Really see this centre rib here, it's almost like a train wheel with a flange on, and this bites down into muddy soil and kind of gives you like a little track to run in, and this will steer much better on muddy ground than a car tyre which is flat and it sort of skids across it and makes you look like a bit of an idiot. Whilst we're around the back of the machine, underneath this cover is the drive chain from the engine camshaft. So this is running at half engine speed down to the clutch. The clutch is actually a brake drum, and it's arranged so that when your foot is off the pedal, there's a big spring that holds the brake shoes in contact with the clutch drum, and when you press the pedal it releases the shoes, so it works the other way round to a normal brake. If you dig out your Thwaites manual, you'll see that underneath that cover there's a little square-headed adjustment screw which you can use to adjust the clutch, which you do with the pedal depressed. I've got a piece of wood which I wedge the pedal down with, and you adjust the clutch. Be really careful once you've adjusted it, because the gearbox is sufficiently slow running that it will engage first and reverse even when the clutch is still driving, and it'll go into gear and the dumper will take off and you put your foot down on the clutch and it doesn't declutch, and neither will it come out of gear. This is one of those times when having a remote engine stop's really handy, because it saves you trashing your car. When I restored this machine, clutch shoes were still available from Thwaites, as were a couple of other items. The sprockets from the engine to the clutch drum are specials. Thwaites no longer hold them, but I was able to order standard industrial component sprockets from a power transmission specialist, and I had to modify the bosses of the sprockets to suit, and there was a bit of machining and a bit of welding involved. Squirt some drive chain spray in through there every time I go anywhere in the machine, and it's all still sounding nice. I've not even had to adjust the chain. So why did Thwaites use this bizarre arrangement where the engine is offset to one side with a big bicycle chain driving off the camshaft to a brake drum that's a clutch? And with the gearbox down here, it just seems bonkers. It's almost as if they've had a load of random spare parts and needed to use them up For years I thought it was quite silly. To understand Thwaites' strange driving arrangements a bit better, look at a more conventional machine for a few moments and its limitations. Big, bulky differential, a short prop shaft, the gearbox, a bell housing which is ventilated because it's an air-cooled engine, so it takes up more space, and finally the engine, which is at the very back of the machine. So what you find with these machines is that when they're empty there's very little weight over the front and they lose grip embarrassingly easily. Also when they're empty there's a load of weight, because of the engine, on the rear axle. So these dumpers very often get stuck when empty, and it's really amazing what they won't do when empty and what they won't drive up. These things will wheel spin embarrassingly easily. When they're full, however, all of the weight is all over this front axle, and then the rear axle becomes very light, so you'll have incredible grip on the front, only you can't steer very well. That's the limitations of conventional two-wheel drive rear steer dumper. And now to compare with the Tusker. Because they've offset the engine from the centre of the machine to the left-hand side and put the gearbox alongside the engine in the middle, plus there's no bell housing, means that the whole lot is moved forward in the machine. Therefore, under all circumstances, the weight of the engine, because it's further forward, is shared more equally between the rear wheels that steer and the front wheels that drive. This means that the Tusker, when you're using it as a dumper and you haven't got this big heavy digger arm on the front, has always got much superior traction when empty because there's more weight over the front wheels. The Tusker skip is actually been designed to be further back, so again it's sharing the weight not only over the front wheels but sharing it onto the back wheels. So when loaded, the Tusker dumper is more able to steer than its near competitors, and that is why I believe Thwaites chose this seemingly bizarre design with a offset engine and a chain drive to a gearbox, because from the same set of components, albeit in a different order, you get a much higher performance out of this dumper. And this shows if you see one of these in use as a dumper. They're always the last to lose grip over any of their competitors, which might use a more traditional bell housing arrangement like the one we've just seen. As with all my other videos, this is kind of taking a bit longer than I thought, so might be time for a break and maybe a part 2.